This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Last school year, college students across the nation protested to bring attention to the Israel-Hamas war. Since the war started, nearly 40,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, with almost 2 million people displaced, and more than 1,500 Israelis have been killed, most during the Hamas attack on October 7th last year. That's according to the United Nations. Student protesters have been calling for a ceasefire and are also demanding their schools divest from Israel. In Connecticut, students have created encampments on college greens and led demonstrations. The protests have been largely peaceful, but there have been some arrests of both students and faculty members. At some college campuses, administrators have welcomed the student activism, but the new school year has brought new policies around protesting. Today, we hear what this means for student organizers across Connecticut and beyond. With us is Kate Hidalgo Bellows, who is a staff reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education, covering today's students and campus culture. And she joins us today from Washington, D.C. Good morning, Kate.
Good morning.
And also with us is Antonia Kambolis, who's a junior at Trinity College. Thanks, Antonia, for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
And Batya Kline, who is a student organizer at Wesleyan University. Welcome back, Batya.
Thanks so much for having me again.
And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Kate, I want to start with you this morning. Before we get into what we're seeing this school year, could you remind our listeners what we saw last year on campuses across the nation when it comes to protests and encampments?
Sure. So after the October 7th attack, many pro-Palestinian student organizers participated in activism to draw attention to the suffering of Palestinians under siege in Gaza and to demand colleges end financial and academic relationships with Israel and call for a ceasefire as well. When the Columbia University students created their encampment, a lot of students followed at other campuses, followed in their steps, and created their own tent formations. And those ended in a variety of ways. Many ended with police intervention and arrests. Some ended with agreements between administrators and students, facilitating meetings with members of colleges' investment committees, and others ended with students packing up and leaving once they decided that the encampment had served its purpose. But the fallout from that has continued. Students were suspended, some were expelled, others were made to write apology letters. And many faculty members too received, bans from campus or suspensions from their teaching duties. Those cases were referred to prosecutors' offices, and many of those district attorneys have thrown those cases out since then. So that's how the last school year ended, and I'm happy to talk more about what happened over the summer as well.
Sure. If you give us an update of what's been happening and what have you been seeing, and sort of like an update up until now, really.
Yeah. So over the summer, a lot of colleges doubled down on making their protest and encampment policies stricter. So they limited masking. They also, some banned the use of sound amplification devices during certain hours of the day. There were further restrictions on signage, where and when students can protest, defining anti-Semitism to include anti-Zionism. So a lot of different changes there. And they're able to make many of these changes because time, place, and manner rules apply to public campuses. So colleges that have to follow the First Amendment can still restrict protests in ways involving time, place, and manner.
So we definitely want to get into more details with that throughout the conversation. But Kate, what do we see regarding universities that have met with students to discuss divestment?
Sure. So for the most part, we have not seen universities and colleges divest from weapons manufacturers or from Israel or commit to academic boycotts. But there is a notable exception. San Francisco State University announced recently that it was committing to divesting from weapons manufacturers in its foundation. And that was a win for the divestment movement. But beyond that, most of the accomplishments have had to do with guaranteeing a meeting with investment officials. The other kind of complication is that some state laws prevent colleges in those states from agreeing to the boycott, divest, and sanction movement. So that's adding some tensions to the student protesters' demands.
And Batya, you've been sort of on the ground since the beginning. And last year, when we spoke with you about what was happening on Wesleyan's campus, could you remind our listeners what the encampment looked like and how the university responded?
Yeah, so I've been involved in Palestine organizing at Wesleyan for 6 years. And so it has really been a ramp up over a long period of time. And we draw from the South African apartheid divest movement, where there was mass arrests, mass encampments at Wesleyan University that achieved divestment over a long period of time. They pushed the university to divest from that horrifying, state that was implementing very violent racism in a systematic way, just as the state of Israel is doing right now. So last year, we established an encampment in the tradition of the Columbia students and the student intifada that was sprouting up across the country, with encampments in hundreds and hundreds of university locations. And we had over 100 tents. We had hundreds of people staying overnight, people who had never learned about Palestine before, people being educated about the history of violence that the state of Israel has perpetrated on the Palestinian people. And we taught about the intersection of Palestine with so many different issues that are so important to students, with the native, the expulsion of native people in Middletown, where my university is, the similarities between that with, the other horrifying, violent, state-sanctioned genocides that are happening right now in Sudan, in Xinjiang, China. Like we had programs that sought to educate and mobilize the entire student body. And the outcome of that encampment in terms of our relationship with the administration was that we went through a process of negotiations to get, like Kate was talking about, a committee of investor responsibility to take on the work of making a proposal to the Board of Trustees. But what we realize now is that strategy of the university engaging with negotiations and creating this committee was to delay and ignore and maintain their investments in the weapons companies. The biggest achievement of the encampment was that the university disclosed that 1.7% of their endowment is invested in weapons companies perpetrating horrifying violence around the world, and including in Palestine, and 0.4% of the endowment in Israeli software companies, which likewise are profiting from the horrifying, violent apartheid system and genocide that is going on right now. So all in all, that equates to over $25 million. And they have really acted in bad faith and ignored the Committee of Investor Responsibility and delegitimized it in multiple ways. The administration representatives of the committee left the committee after the proposal was put in place. They didn't put in a dissenting opinion. They left and sent a delegitimizing resignation letter. And the investment trustees have totally ignored, gone radio silent on that committee. So we've seen a process of delay and trying to ignore the will of the student body, which is over 86% in support of divestment, according to the referendum we passed last year.
And Antonia, I want to bring you here to share your experience at Trinity College. What has the encampment last year looked like, and what is it looking like this year?
So I think the inciting incident of activism on our campus regarding Palestine really occurred after Thanksgiving break, when we returned to campus to find out that one of our classmates had been shot in Burlington, Vermont, with two of his friends for simply wearing a kufiya and smoking cigarettes. And so this, not only the action itself, but the response or lack thereof from our administration really enraged and mobilized students to start putting in the work and really organizing. This culminated in a coalition of student organizations on campus organizing, and a faculty coalition of faculty members in support of Palestine. This led to Palestinian Solidarity Week, which was our biggest programming of the fall semester, and really solidified our base on campus in opposition with the really apathetic student body that we have, largely who had never really been mobilized. So we were able to create this base and continue to protest throughout the end of the fall semester into the spring, which eventually led to our encampment, which began on May 1st. And we were able to we engaged in protests bigger and more escalated than we had ever on campus before in this movement. Also, piggybacking off of what Batya said, we were also looking at what had been happening in the divestment movement at Trinity in prior years in the apartheid movement. As I have previously mentioned, Trinity has a largely apathetic, sometimes conservative base of population of students. So we were really reflecting on that small pocket of activism that Trinity has always had. Deep inside. But yes, so we were protesting, educating. We had a community of students, a smaller core community, but again, on a smaller campus with definitely a different makeup of students than, say, like Wesleyan would have, for example. We were able to definitely shake things up, and we had engaged in negotiations. And so we didn't decamp until we had felt that until administration agreed to move forward with our demands for divestment. And I can definitely talk more about that and where we are now.
I do want to bring in Kate here. We had asked Wesleyan University ahead of the show about their university policies related to what we're talking about today. And they gave us a statement saying, Wesleyan protects the right to protest and express one's views, so long as those actions do not disrupt the normal operations of campus life. Our disruptions policy is longstanding and affords our students significant latitude to express their views and protest peacefully. The university does not plan to adjust this policy at this time. Kate, I want to ask your thoughts on this statement. Does it follow in line with what you're hearing from other colleges as well?
Yeah, the arguments that I've heard from colleges that I've spoken to or read about is that these policies that they're introducing still preserve the right to free speech, that they're following their legal obligations. Obviously, at Wesleyan, it's not a public college, so it's different. But in general, you're hearing them really double down on them. There are some exceptions where they've gotten feedback between the proposed and the final policy and adjusted it as needed in accordance to what students and faculty members have said. We've seen that at the University of South Florida and then also at American University. So there have the protests against the protest policies have been effective in some places. And I think that we're just going to have to see how it plays out in terms of those new policies. But students are definitely paying attention, and they're finding different ways to fight back against them.
Well, and with that, too, we also have a statement here from Trinity College who said, we will allow peaceful demonstrations so long as these demonstrations do not infringe upon our academic mission or the health and safety of members of our campus community. So I think there's a lot of echoes here of very similar sentiments in these two policies and statements. Mm-hmm. How much does this tell us about how they're thinking about protests on campus, Kate?
Yeah, so I think there's a fissure between what students see as the purpose of protests and what administrators see. Students are saying that the point is to disrupt, the point is to feel uncomfortable. And I think they feel that their universities and colleges are not respecting that, and that also that there is an exception to the ways that colleges talk about free speech that applies to Palestine only. It's a term called the Palestine exception, posits that while colleges allow a broad range of political speech, speech advocating for the rights of Palestinians crosses a line, and many see that as a double standard. But colleges are saying we just cannot continue this way and have constant disruptions because it's affecting the way our students learn, it's affecting our reputation, and it's also like just affecting the unity of the campus body. So that's how they respond to those criticisms.
And we're going to talk more of that, the phrase Palestine exception later on today as well. But I do want to ask Batya, you just heard from Wesleyan's statement and other colleges in terms of their current ideas of protesting. Can you respond to what we heard from both of the colleges in regards to their policies around protests?
Yeah, I can absolutely speak, even in the last few weeks, around Wesleyan's claim that they're not modifying, not changing their disruptions policy, but in practice, they are totally implementing new policies. Just yesterday, they installed new cameras around campus that have built-in face recognition and voice recognition AI, so that they could go through the log, and if someone is talking about protests near these cameras, then they would be able to identify who said what where. So they're putting in the infrastructure to surveil, obviously. And just this week, they locked the building that Wesleyan SJP has been operating out of for years, claiming that it has fire safety issues, even though it's exactly in the same condition that it has been for all of my time, 6 years being in there. So they locked it. They're saying they're locking it from now until September 30th. And the Board of Trustees are coming to meet at Wesleyan on September 22nd. So they're locking the building where we keep all of our supplies, our banners and whatnot, just around the time that the trustees are coming in. Likewise, last year, we put up a symbolic structure, a big mock apartheid wall with banners. And we've done this every single year for the past 10 years. And we went through the university process because we wanted it to stay up. So we made the necessary permits. We emailed the necessary people. The day after we put up this wall, I came back. The public safety had totally ripped off the banners that were on this structure and were coming to knock down the wall. And I raised a fuss. I was like, I did all of what you asked. And they said, oh, it's something on our end about we did not, they didn't communicate it. But their first instinct was to knock down this display that was in support of Palestinian rights, that was in protest of the horrifying violence that is currently occurring, the bombs that are being dropped on people, in tents, in schools, in hospitals, right? And their first instinct was to knock that down. It wasn't to see if we had gotten those necessary permits, which we had. So the Palestine exception is totally enacted at Wesleyan, even if their policies haven't changed. Their practices have totally been oppressive to the Palestine movement.
And Antonia, really quickly here, especially with what Batya just shared with her own experience on Wesleyan's campus, what are your thoughts about Trinity's statements about protests, and what are you seeing so far?
Yeah, so at the end of the encampment, a email went out from one of the deans expressing the administrative actions that would take place going forward. And we were told that this email that we knew was going out would also talk about our demands. It did nothing of the sort. It only talked about further administrative actions. We have seen administration really crack down on certain areas of protest. Definitely campus safety. We've seen, definitely cracking down on louder protests that we've had. And they've definitely enforced this. If you're going to escalate, know that you will be met with serious repercussions. But we will continue to move forward. Definitely not to the extent that we haven't seen the administration engage in the way that Wesleyan has, for example, but we have definitely been met with certain threats of talking about administrative action and repercussions, which we are going to deal with going forward.
Well, and Kate, with what Batya and Antonia just shared, I think there's also been concern over safety for students on campus in the midst of protests, before, after, during, and how to sort of balance that too with students' right to free speech. What are we hearing about that now? Are there still concerns about student safety?
I just want to ask a clarifying question.
Sure.
Do you mean the student safety of the protesters or of the campus community?
I think maybe a mix of both.
Yeah, I think that we're seeing a greater police presence on some college campuses in response to concerns about protests. And the argument from protesters against the increased police response is that the police are making students feel unsafe, and with pepper spray, weapons, et cetera, that it is wrong to respond to peaceful protest with a police response. And you're hearing from the administration saying that this is necessary to keep the entire campus safe, that we have an obligation to everyone and not just to the protesters. There have been a couple of high-profile anti-Semitic bias incidents at a couple of campuses already this semester. That's also factoring into this. We saw that at the University of Pittsburgh and also at the University of Michigan. So those are also putting administrators on watch.
Well, thank you so much for that. We'll be coming back from a break and continuing this conversation. With us today is Kate Hidalgo-Bellows. She's a staff reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. And we're also hearing from students around our state, including Antonia Kambolis and also Batya Kline from Wesleyan and Trinity. Coming up, a representative from ACLU of Connecticut weighs in on the new university policies. And we here at Connecticut Public have been covering the Israel-Hamas war from all different angles. To see all of our coverage, visit ctpublic.org. You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about protests and demonstrations happening at colleges and universities this school year. Policies around protests look different depending on the campus. Ahead of this hour, we reached out to several universities in Connecticut, including the University of Connecticut, and they told us the student code was updated over the past year, as were policies for posting signs, holding outdoor activities, and using amplified sound. The updates were done to lend clarity while remaining content neutral. The updates provide clarity by distinguishing between those activities and camping and encampments in which tents become de facto living spaces for an unlimited duration that compromise our ability to ensure safe, healthy, and equally accessible spaces to all people as expected on a public university's campus. UConn is just one of many universities that have recently updated their policies. Some are saying protests and demonstrations can only take place at certain times. For example, at Emerson College in Boston, protests can only take place between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. Joining us now to unpack these policies is Dan Barrett. He's the legal director of the ACLU of Connecticut. Dan, welcome to Where We Live today.
Well, thanks. Good morning.
Dan, we just want to sort of get your thoughts. You've been listening to the conversation about the various policies in our college campuses here in Connecticut. Can you talk about how will these policies be enforced? Do they have any legal precedent? Is this something that we've seen before?
There's a fork in the road right up top that we should talk about, which is, I think Kate talked about it earlier, but there's the difference between private colleges and universities and public ones. Private colleges and universities are typically not bound by the First Amendment or their state constitutional equivalent. So they are largely operating in a world of public perception and promises that they've made to their students in their code of conduct and a variety of other things. Public colleges and universities, on the other hand, are bound by the First Amendment and in Connecticut by our twin state constitutional speech protections. And so they have significantly less room to navigate, which is great for students and faculty members who want to express their views. So as to, when we talk about free speech, we're really only talking about places that are bound by the First Amendment, for which there is a legally enforceable concept of free speech. So sadly for our students and faculty members on private campuses, their job, I think, when it comes to speech restrictions is to kind of advocate within what a university fears most, I think, which is none of our colleges and universities, none of our private colleges and universities really want to be seen as a place in which free speech is unwelcome, or students are not free to air their views. That's the very purpose of a university. But nonetheless, there's nothing that, in particular that we can do about it under the First Amendment. Now, our public universities are quite a bit different. And it's the First Amendment speech clause is tremendously complex and gives us a number of very unsatisfying tools by which we can adjudge speech restrictions. But I'm going to paraphrase greatly and say, roughly speaking, the idea is fairness and predictability when it comes to this context. So we want to make sure that the university or the college is not playing favorites. So it cannot pick and choose and say, for example, there's unlimited opportunity to protest for students who are expressing this view, but there's extremely narrow opportunities for students expressing a different view. That's prohibited. You also want some element of knowing what the rules are, so predictability. There's no particular use in a rule that says, for example, protests shall not be unruly. Nobody really knows what that means. And we're talking about a college campus, so the whole thing's unruly. So the closer you get to specified hours, specified volume limits, days, the whole 9 yards, where a student can actually know, okay, if I want to put on a protest, am I running the risk? When can I do it? What permits do I need? And am I running any kind of risk by exceeding a certain noise level? That's the base of what the First Amendment requires. I can talk more, but I've been talking a lot.
Well, I mean, based on what we've been hearing so far, really, we've covered so much ground, but we are, I think, very aware that it's still very murky, I think, because it sounds like it depends on the campus. It depends on where you are. It's not a very one-size-fit-all scenario. And for some, I think it's a very new space to navigate. And earlier we had talked about the Palestine exception. And Dan, you mentioned, schools are not allowed to pick and choose what students can protest over. Can you explain to listeners more in depth of what that looks like?
Sure. So your kind of typical example of something that would be prohibited under what I'm roughly calling, the equal treatment. Really, we call it, I think Kate mentioned it, content-based discrimination or viewpoint-based discrimination, where a government entity is picking and choosing which part of a discussion it wants to hear. The easiest example would be that one student group has no problem getting permits for a demonstration, and it exceeds its permits, and no one is arrested, and no one is charged under the campus code of conduct. A different student group is denied permits. There's a heavy police presence. Students are hauled away, et cetera, et cetera. So in those situations, it looks like the government would be playing favorites. Maybe a more salient example might be a university permitting an activity to go while denying, let's say, a sporting event, a pep rally, or something like that, something that the university favors, while denying the ability of, let's say, a pro-Palestinian protest to go. That starts to look suspicious under the First Amendment. The other concept, as you noted, Catherine, that's a little unusual here, is that we're talking about university campuses, and I think we would say, like, in their best versions, they are a little bit loud and chaotic. They're also like miniature towns, and so the idea of what a disruption looks like on a campus in which most people stay up until 2 a.m. and like wear pajamas to class is a little bit different from what it looks like in Connecticut cities and towns. And things are also squished together, which makes for any university claim of trying to avoid disruption or excessive noise a little tough to get to the bottom of. People on university campuses live pretty much right near where they go to class. So when you start getting into justifications of we don't want to disrupt campus, I think it gets a little trickier and a little tougher to figure out if there's a legitimate concern here or if this is a really easy way to say there's really not going to be, for example, any amplified noise on campus other than 9 to 5, which, by the way, is when most people are in class.
Right. I mean, I remember a former professor have joked that he enjoys the free music that he gets from students. And jokingly aside, it's a very complicated process that I think we're trying to wade through because, what is disruptive? And I think the definition is very different, it sounds like, between campuses. And Kate, this is something that you also pointed out earlier as well. Can you respond to what we just heard from Dan? Are there the same rules around protests applied to political protests versus protests around the Israel-Hamas war?
Right. So as Dan pointed out, public colleges can't commit to or cannot participate in viewpoint discrimination. They have to apply the same rules regardless of viewpoint when it comes to allowable speech and speech that they can restrict. And so if you're looking at the landscape of new protest policies, it's looking very different from campus to campus and very restrictive at certain campuses, especially those that have limited the times that students can engage in protests. And the pushback from groups like the ACLU and FIRE is that that these public colleges need to allow the broadest range of speech that they can, that they shouldn't make it too burdensome. And students and faculty members especially are responding that restrictions requiring prior approval for scheduled events are too burdensome to be in line with the First Amendment and their stated missions. So that's kind of the debate that we're seeing over protests right now.
And Antonia, I want to ask you here, as you're listening to Dan and Kate sort of break this down for us, what are your thoughts about that debate right now?
So I think with the way things are going with student protests, I think that we are definitely at a point where, specifically at Trinity, we are preparing to. Our student leaders are preparing to meet with the investment subcommittee. And so since the encampment, we have had to, negotiate, and we are preparing for that. And you're definitely at a critical inflection point with our protests and everything. And if these don't continue to go, if the negotiations and the meeting with the Board of Trustees does not go the way we want it to in terms of moving towards disclosure and divestment, we are willing to escalate our protests. So far, we have not been met with police force, but with the changing of the policies that have been seen at campuses around the country, we are prepared to meet with the reckoning of changing policies. And on a smaller campus, I think that is something that is definitely felt in shockwaves, especially considering that our base is so small to begin with. We are definitely... We're a very vulnerable movement. Most of our core participants and our advocates are international students, so they're worried about deportation on top of just regular police intervention. But we are not backing down, and I could definitely talk more about leading up to the meeting with the Board of Trustees.
And before we do that, I do want to ask Batya here too, that you've visited other campuses as well. What have you seen at other encampments regarding the debate of the changes in policy and the disciplinary action? Really quickly here.
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to make a correction that around the state, the students are not protesting the Israel-Hamas war. We're protesting the genocidal actions of the state of Israel against the civilian population in Gaza, right? When a group of people are locked into a very small geographic area and pushed into supposed safe zones that are then, bombed relentlessly while people are in tents in schools, while people are starved, right? This is not a war, so that's not an appropriate word, because we're not talking about the military conflict between the resistance movement and the state of Israel. We're talking about the state of Israel's actions against the civilian population. So that's what we're really protesting, and specifically the U.S. and our university's role in facilitating that by providing money to the weapons companies that are dropping those bombs, that are making those bombs, that are surveilling. So I just wanted to make that correction. And across the state, we feel that the most disruptive thing that can happen to university and the most, endangering thing that can be implemented against the student body is when they bring police who have guns, who have tear gas, who have pepper spray into the university space and then beat up students and arrest them. I have multiple friends who were arrested in their encampment spaces. And there was a student who was severely injured with a neck injury, cannot go back to class because, of a really bad injury that these police, that their university presidents called in to hurt them. And it's ridiculous. And it's not exactly. It is a degree of what the Palestinian students are experiencing right now, right? In Birzeit University in Palestine, hundreds of students cannot continue class because they are in prison, because they were involved in student governance. It is a crime to be involved in student governance in Palestine. So there are hundreds of students who are currently in prison that cannot continue with classes. And what's worse, in Gaza, there are 600,000 students who cannot go back to class because their schools were destroyed, many while there were students sheltering in them, right? It's that's the most disruptive thing, is that we are being brutalized here for speaking out, and there's just complete silence about students our age being brutalized in Palestine right now.
And Kate, I would like you to respond here with what Batya just shared. Is this something that you're hearing as well with your reporting?
Yes. What I'm hearing from a lot of students is that they really want the attention from the media to be on the situation in Israel and Gaza, and that they feel that they can be a voice for the people in Gaza who are not able to go to school right now or to university, whose buildings have been bombed. So that's what I'm hearing from students, is that why can't we participate in protests here to draw attention to what's going on in Gaza when the people there don't have as much of a voice as we do on the U.S., aren't going to get the same media attention.
And Dan, really quickly here too, also would like you to respond to what you've been hearing so far.
Well, I couldn't agree with Batya more that the most perhaps disruptive and disturbing element of a university's response would be inviting the police in, effectively calling the police on their own students. Just like anyone who calls the police has to bear in mind, the university really has to imagine that once they call the police, the situation is out of their control. The police and later prosecutors will make decisions about how to handle these students that the university likely would not agree with. And so the very decision to invite the police to do something like that spirals things further out of control. And I think universities came to kind of regret what they did over the spring. I hope that that's not repeated in this fall.
Well, thank you so much for that. You've been listening to Dan Barrett, who's the legal director of ACLU Connecticut. Thank you so much, Dan, for being with us today.
Thanks much.
The rest of our guests will continue to stay with us after a quick break. And just a quick note for our listeners that the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, has yet to rule on whether the claim of genocide is plausible, but it has ordered Israel to take steps to prevent any acts of genocide in Gaza. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we've been speaking with Connecticut college students about protest policies on campus. And Kate, I want to jump straight to you for this conversation here because we've been talking about a lot of the changes in policy. There's no changes in policy. Many of these campuses have sort of been abiding by the rules that are already in the books. And we're seeing sort of the consequences for certain students and faculty members as well. How have the demonstrations seen on campus impacted college admissions? Is this something that you've been seeing?
I would answer that with it's too early to say. I don't think we know yet how the spring protests will affect application rates to especially the elite colleges that got a lot of attention last year for their encampments. By the point that those were happening, the application period was over, even if some students had not committed yet to a college. So I don't think we'll have a good answer to that for a number of months, but certainly colleges have experienced reputational harm.
And we've been speaking a lot too with student protests wanting universities to divest from Israel. How likely are we going to be seeing universities to start doing that? I know you raised an example earlier with San Francisco State University, but so far that seems to be a singular example.
I think that I don't feel comfortable speculating on how common it'll be.
Sure.
Divestment. I think that when we have seen successes for the divestment movement like San Francisco State, it's been a little bit more narrowly tailored than divest from Israel.
Or can we actually maybe dig deeper into what does divestment look like in practice?
Sure. So divestment means withdrawing investments in companies that do business with Israel or are weapons manufacturers, and those are targeting colleges, endowments that fund things like scholarships. So that's what divestment means. Many students are also calling for an academic boycott of Israel, meaning not partnering with academic institutions in the country.
Really quickly here, Antonia.
So, as I mentioned before, our student leaders are getting ready to meet with the investment subcommittee of the Board of Trustees in September. And we are really Trinity specifically is really at this critical point. Our school just turned 200 years old this past year, and we've seen a lot of programming and a lot of messaging around innovation and moving forward and what the next 200 years would look like. And I think that this is the opportunity for the college to really practice what they preach. I think that this is an opportunity for that. If Trinity follows through with this, they would be a national leader in human rights. And that is the Trinity that I want to go to. And I also don't want to completely center the negotiations. The protests will continue if our demands are not met, and we will not stop with the action that we have brought for the past year until there is an end to this genocide. And divestment is definitely a way forward, but we are continuing in the ways that we have been doing so.
And Batya, we got about a minute here, but any final thoughts of what you would like our listeners to know about encampments on campus?
I would just echo what Antonia said about we are going to continue this. Divestment is the first step, right, in the South African apartheid movement. Divestment from by states, municipalities, towns and universities was very important. But just mobilizing the entire world to say apartheid is bad, right? Apartheid is evil. This state is implementing really violent racism. So we're going to work to have that, complete mobilization and change so that people can just recognize that Palestinian people deserve to be free and that the state of Israel is currently enacting really unacceptable violence across Palestine.
And Kate, I would also love to get some final thoughts from you as well. As we continue with the school year, anything that you're looking out for as the semester continues?
Sure. So we're looking out to see whether there will be escalations around the anniversary of the October 7th attack and around the election. Student protesters are also mingling with the uncommitted movement, trying to push Vice President Harris to the left on Gaza. So I think those are areas to watch for this upcoming year.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Kate. You've been listening to Kate Hidalgo Bellows, who's a staff reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today and helping us understand the situation better.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
And also with us was Antonia Kambolis, who's a junior at Trinity College. Antonia, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your experience with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Batya Kline, who's a student organizer at Wesleyan University. We appreciate your time and sharing your experience with us as well.
Thank you very much.
And as a reminder for our listeners, starting next week, Where We Live will move to a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday schedule. We're excited to announce that Connecticut Public's weekly show, Disrupted, with the wonderful Kalila Brown Dean, will move from Wednesday at 2 p.m. to Friday at 9 a.m. So make sure to tune in and check it out. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.